Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents The Stories Old Towns Tell, A Journey Through Cities at the Heart of Europe, by Marek Kohn. Narrated by Philip Battley. Introduction. 7 Symbolic Quarters. In the summer of 2017, I was invited to answer a questionnaire for Conversations with Europe, an online project created by Rebecca Buck, a pro-European blogger. One of the questions was, do you have a favourite place in Europe? If so, where is it, and why do you love it? I only had to think about that for a moment before I saw the answer in my mind's eye. The Old Town, I replied. It has a cobbled square, lots of Gothic overhangs, colourful heraldry featuring lions and boars' heads, narrow alleys, and not many right angles. It is in my imagination, as well as in the middle of many European cities, and I love it because it is the heart of my Europe. The idea for this book grew from that reply, but it had a lifetime behind it. When I was a young child, my first journey abroad took me from England to the heart of Europe. It crossed the 2 countries in which most of this book's action takes place, Germany and Poland, although in those days Germany itself was 2 countries. I was just old enough to be anxious about what would happen when we came to what was known as the Iron Curtain, and then to be a little disappointed that there was no great metal barrier across the railway lines running into East Berlin, just a guard in a sentry box at the side of the track. My anxieties were revived by the East German security officer who boarded the train, and I must have been relieved when he finally decided our papers were in order. Did he have a green uniform with a pistol in a holster? In my memory it seems that he did. A column of tanks had clattered past, borne on the wagons of a goods train, as we waited on a platform in West Germany. Deep inside Poland, a station's pre-war German name was visible through a fading coat of paint on its signal box. These scenes of division and the shadows of war impressed Europe's history upon me. Time has passed. Europe's history has continued to unfold. While the images in my memory have become attenuated, their lessons have grown more profound. But they haven't diminished the appeal of the fantasy Old Town, definitely Middle European as far as I'm concerned, in which history is charming and harmless. If anything, they have enhanced it. A comfortingly half-timbered and cobbled historic European quarter is the ideal spot for a brief escape from European history repeating itself. The journey's destination was the town of Toruń, where the Polish side of my family has had a home since before the war. Toruń's centre, proudly Gothic, was my first old town, and I still feel it to be part of my personal heritage, despite having previously failed to learn from its robust grid plan that some of the finest old towns in Europe were built on right angles. When I visited it in 2018 to register my details after recovering the Polish citizenship that had been revoked before my childhood visit, I took the opportunity to orient myself for an exploration of old towns. I found a gazetteer laid out along the central street, a series of tablets bearing the heraldic shields of cities to which Toruń had been linked by trade networks, reaching westwards as far as Leiden and Cologne during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. With the Iron Curtain gone, and borders within the European Union mostly not even a formality, the city had celebrated its historic place in Europe by selecting symbols from its past that claimed a place for it in Europe's future. The tablets form an elegant display, and a neat illustration of how old towns are made to work. Another old town occupied a special place in the stories about Poland's history and character that I was told as a child. It was at the heart of the story of Warsaw's destruction by Nazi German occupiers and the Polish capital's post-war reconstruction, in which Poles cleared the rubble by hand and then painstakingly recreated the old town in its historic form. The lesson was that despite the extraordinary barbarities visited upon Poland by its enemies, the nation's spirit could not be broken. It was a lesson not just for Poles, but for the world at large, as President Biden affirmed when he spoke at Warsaw's Royal Castle, which forms an ensemble with the adjacent Old Town, a month after Russia launched its assault on Ukraine. We are gathered here at the royal castle in this city that holds a sacred place in the history not only of Europe, but humankind's unending search for freedom, he declared. As Joe Biden and his team appreciated, the castle was a setting of ideal symbolic aptness for the American president's history-defining message that democracy faced years and decades of struggle against the forces of autocracy. By using the royal castle as the stage for a rallying speech in response to Russia's invasion, Biden demonstrated that historic quarters are not just reserves for relics, but live sites with roles to play in current affairs and contemporary consciousness. A further demonstration followed in the summer, when the wrecks of Russian armoured vehicles knocked out by Ukrainian forces were put on display in the square between the royal castle and the Old Town. The oxidized armour, symbolizing the possibility that Russia could be defeated, was thus posed against a background of buildings rebuilt after their destruction by the Nazi aggressors. Introducing the exhibit, the Polish Prime Minister's Chief of Staff declared that the square embodies the heroism of the Polish defenders during the Warsaw Uprising, while also standing as a witness to the devastation inflicted on the city by the occupiers. Today we are dealing with a similar situation in Ukraine, he observed. Russian barbarians are destroying villages and cities. The story of Warsaw's Old Town in 1944 was summoned up to help tell the story of Ukrainian cities in 2022. On another front, a few months before Russia's onslaught initiated a new phase of Europe's history, Poland's Justice Minister welcomed the European Union's Commissioner for Justice to Warsaw with a framed photo of the Old Town laid waste after the Nazi occupation. Having previously accused the European Union of waging hybrid war against Poland in a dispute about Polish government actions that the EU regarded as threats to the rule of law, the minister explained that his passive-aggressive gift symbolized Poland's sensitivities about the equal treatment of nations. It certainly illustrated the indestructible symbolic authority of the Old Town's ruins, the moral foundation of the reconstructed quarter. As a child of Polish heritage, I was awed and filled with pride by Poland's great national stories. As a person of both British and Polish heritage, I've gone through life with a constant background awareness that one story is never the whole story, a belief that is better to bring identities together than to keep them apart, and a sense that stories are enriched by informing each other. I found a text that spoke to those feelings in a third Old Town, that of Lublin in southeastern Poland, where one of the old gatehouse buildings has been turned into a centre devoted to the memory of the city's Jewish population, exterminated in the Holocaust. A panel on the wall addresses a frequently asked question. Jews who come here ask us, "Why do you do this? After all, you are not Jewish. You are Poles, and the Jewish town is not your history." Poles ask us, "Why do you do this? After all, you are Poles, and the Jewish town is not our history. Or maybe you are Jewish." We explain patiently that it is our common Polish-Jewish history. To remember the murdered Jews, you do not have to be Jewish. Like the mathematical models that scientists devise in order to clarify the complexities of life, this sequence demonstrates the power and the necessity of simplification. In most contexts, unqualified distinctions between Jews and Poles act to efface the possibility that people might be both Jewish and Polish. Here, the binary acts in the opposite direction. It serves to heighten the rhetorical contrast, and thereby to sharpen the argument that the two groups are more closely intertwined than is widely assumed. Those who read the Polish and Hebrew versions of the text will be aware of the fraught histories that lie behind it, but those who read the text in English may not appreciate the implications that underlie Polish questions about whether a person is Jewish, or the undermining effects that they can have upon both public and personal conversation. As it happened, I encountered the question myself at the end of the tour, in a gallery dedicated to righteous, non-Jewish Poles who helped Jewish compatriots during the war. When I remarked that one of the Jews mentioned in a panel had the same name as me, the guide suggested that I might be a relative. I replied that from what I knew of my family tree it was very unlikely. he gave me a sceptical look that made it plain he thought I was denying Jewish ancestry. I'm reluctant to answer the question because it is always loaded one way or another, and also because the full answer remains mysterious. But I'm happy to imagine that my surname marks a time when Jewish and Christian Poles could be relatively relaxed about interlinking their family histories through marriage. There is too much to say on these themes, and often the more that is said, the more difficult it becomes to resolve them. Sometimes divisive certainties are best countered not by nuance, but by simple and bold declaration of values. The assertion of a common Polish-Jewish history was like a revelation that I already knew, filling me with a sweet sense of recognition, gratitude, and relief combined. I still feel heartened when I look at the photo I took of the panel, and reassured that better histories are possible. A cobbled square in an old quarter of a European city, filled with people eating ice creams and chatting in their various languages, is a scene of triumph. Historic spaces in which people gather together freely and convivially, among strangers but at ease with them, represent how far the continent has succeeded in transcending its history. Turning the past into picturesque ambience, they convey a sense of safety and peace. Where the remnants of old defensive walls still stand, the obsolete masonry offers the reassuring suggestion that the age of conflicts was a long time ago. Old towns affirm that the European condition need not be one of eternal conflict between endlessly arising and realigning adversaries. They are beacons of the redemptive European project. The message is especially eloquent in cities that were devastated during the Second World War and then divided from each other for more than 40 years of Cold War by the Iron Curtain. In the heart of Europe, Germany and the lands to its east, the most catastrophic episodes in the old town's long histories took place within living memory during the Second World War. Firestorms, massacres, ethnic cleansing, genocide. Those were the foundations upon which historic quarters were rebuilt into urban Arcadias. When the Cold War and the 20th century were finally behind them, the region's old towns completed their transformation from places in which war seemed inescapable to ones in which it seemed unimaginable, at least until Russia brought the fear of imperial aggression back to Europe once again. The façades plastered over the fractures, though. Old towns make harmonious compositions out of history by omitting, erasing, or downplaying some of its storylines. Since the end of the Second World War, old towns have been painstakingly constructed to narrate their histories selectively, edited to highlight some strands while occluding others. To regard the work done on them as simply preservation, the respectful maintenance of a relic island while the rest of the city gets on with its dynamic urban life, is to miss the point of old towns. They are the central symbolic districts of cities, their role as fundamental as those of the central business districts or government quarters. Old towns are the foci of collective memory that make suggestions about collective character. They are nuclei of identity, representing nations and peoples, as well as the cities in which they are embedded. That is inevitably a work in progress, for identities are always changing, and their supporting narratives need to be adjusted with them, either to acknowledge change or to pretend that it doesn't happen. Old towns are always under construction. They are refurbished, restored, reframed, and sometimes rebuilt altogether. Frankfurt am Main opened its new Old Town in 2018 against a backdrop of skyscrapers. It was the latest rethink for a German city still uncertain about what kind of relationship it should have with its past, more than 70 years after the end of the war. By that point, Europeans seemed to have forgotten the lesson of the war, that they must build a new common history dating from 1945. Fewer and fewer of those who had learned it through personal experience were still alive, and as the last of those who had actually fought the war approached extinction, the mood changed. Perhaps it was not entirely coincidental that Europe and the wider world underwent a shift away from openness, amid loud demands to put nations first and to define them narrowly. Neighbours were to be begrudged, and strangers to be regarded with suspicion. People wanted their borders back. 2 years after the opening of Frankfurt's new Old Town, they got them. Lines that had become visible only on maps became impassable barriers as European states sealed themselves off in response to the coronavirus pandemic. The eerie emptiness of public spaces provided a jarring illustration of why we should treasure the sight of people wandering through cobbled streets, eating ice creams, and mingling with each other freely. And 2 years after that, as coronavirus restrictions were beginning to be lifted, Russia's attack on Ukraine showed that European cities could still be devastated by bombardment. The onslaught was brutal proof that however far Europe has come since 1945, it has not come far enough. These developments have thrown the significance of old towns into relief. Zones that have been configured to promote singular historical narratives, rather than to interweave the plural histories that they could represent, form a constellation that documents the post-war history of European nationalism itself. If Europe is to hold together, instead of pulling itself apart, it has to find ways of reconciling its histories. With their densely packed payloads of symbols, its old towns are key sites, not just of its past, but also for its future. Their potential for telling inclusive stories has not yet been fully explored. As the American literary critic Van Wyck Brooks observed in 1918, the past is an inexhaustible storehouse of apt attitudes and adaptable ideals. It can furnish a selection of attitudes and ideals to match those favoured in any subsequent period, enabling the compilation of what Brooks called a usable past. Around the world, history is returning with a plethora of vengeances. People are turning to the past from different sides. Some want a reckoning with it, others want to live in it. For people of diverse backgrounds to live well together, they need to develop narratives that integrate their histories, or at least to create frameworks in which their different narratives can coexist. That is also the problem that old towns pose. The question of how to represent plural and sometimes conflicting histories within them has a significance far beyond those highly charged symbolic spaces. To explore it, we have to lift the cobbles and look at the layer of ash underneath. That stratum represents the devastation of cities by carpet bombing, urban battles, and, in the case of Warsaw, systematic demolition by enemy troops. Cities in the core of Europe restarted their histories in 1945 upon 3 founding conditions: the destruction of urban fabric, the genocide of Jewish populations, and the replacement of pre-war inhabitants by people drawn or driven from other places. Although these conditions did not have a uniform impact throughout the region, they defined its post-war landscape. Journeys to the heart of Europe were journeys to the scenes of the most dreadful events in the continent's history, some of them still unfolding. Because it was the zone of greatest devastation, and because new ideological orders were being imposed upon it, this was the region where the most radical questions about reconstruction were posed. That is the decisive reason why this book explores places within the sweep of continental heartland east of the Rhine. Middle Europe can serve as a label for the region, so as to avoid the connotations of Mitteleuropa, Viennese-flavoured nostalgia, bygone German political ambitions, and historians' arguments about where Central Europe is, but not across the entire map of the continent. The book spends much of its time in Polish cities, past and present. It was emotionally natural for me to use my personal heritage as a basis for examining a constellation of European heritage, and analytically logical. Middle Europe's eastern half offers many paths to understanding Europe as a whole, some of them clearer than the ones taken in regions to the west that are inclined to consider themselves more central and significant. In particular, the post-war role of nationalism can be followed more easily in the East than in Germany, where nationalist currents were stifled and confounded by the defeat of their Nazi variant. More fundamentally, awareness of the Eastern half's history inculcates the awareness my first journey across Middle Europe helped to impress upon me, that peace cannot be taken for granted. The burned-out armour displayed against a backdrop of reconstructed old town houses in Warsaw serves as a dramatically apt symbol for that lesson. I did not know that an aggressor would start a war in Europe before I completed this book. but I wrote it because I was alarmed by the growth of the tensions and divisions that find their most extreme form in war. The centrality of the lands east of Germany has now become more widely apparent. More of the book's time is spent in Warsaw's old town and its surrounding stories of the people and the political forces that shaped its reconstruction than in any of the other sites. The old town's wartime drama is uniquely compelling. A siege that became a crucial battle and ended in a tragic defeat, followed by massacres and the near-total destruction of the quarter. Its post-war story is also unique, for although it was not the only historic district in the region to be left almost completely in ruins, it was the only one to be entirely rebuilt in the image of its former self. The resurrection impressed foreign onlookers as a demonstration of national resolve, and presented a model for reconstruction that challenged internationally accepted views about the legitimacy of replicas. It became a landmark in post-war European debates about the preservation of heritage. France's Minister of Culture, the novelist André Malraux, invoked it when he spoke in support of a heritage law framed to protect districts as well as individual buildings. Let's not allow the old streets of Avignon to be destroyed at a time when Poland has rebuilt the oldest square in Warsaw stone by stone, he urged. As a furiously modernizing Europe remade itself in concrete, raising tower blocks in place of houses and driving highways through city centres, Warsaw's old town offered the continent a lesson in values. Sometimes the past was so precious that it had to be recreated if it had ceased to exist. The story of the old town is the story of the people who tried to protect it in the war and rebuilt it afterwards. Right from the start of the occupation, people trained in disciplines surrounding heritage risked and sometimes lost their lives trying to save it. Architects, conservators, and art historians became soldiers of the underground state, with special responsibility for protecting the documentation that would be needed to repair the city's losses. They held soldiers' ranks, and some of them bore arms. After the war, they had to decide whether to work for the reconstruction under a regime that was locking up their former comrades and denouncing the state that they had served. They chose to rebuild for the sake of the nation, directed by authorities that saw heritage such as the old town as a vital resource in the struggle for Polish hearts and minds. Warsaw's old town is one of 7 main sites in this book. They form a loose arc spanning Middle Europe, from Germany to Lithuania, and they offer answers to a complex of questions: how they fared before the war and what happened to them during it, how they were reconstructed afterwards and why, what they remembered and what they forgot, what stories they told and what stories they could tell. Warsaw. Chapter 1. Market to Monument. Warsaw's founding kernel has been old for a long time. The zone within the city's medieval walls first acquired the label in the 15th century, when a new town development began to arise next to it. At that stage, Warsaw was a provincial city of modest importance. Its status, relative to that of Krakow, where the Polish kings had their seat, can be measured by the area of its central market square. At 4 hectares, Krakow's king-size market square is 6 times larger. The balance of power began to shift towards Warsaw in the 16th century. In 1569, the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania were joined together by the Union of Lublin, named after the southern city in which it was signed. The agreement created a dual state known as the Republic, or Commonwealth as modern English-language texts conventionally have it, which in those days did not mean a state without kings. It was a vast, sprawling entity with 2 capitals, Krakow and Vilnius, far apart from each other. Warsaw lies roughly midway between them, so the Union of Lublin agreed that it should be the site for the dual states' parliament. In 1596, King Zygmunt III Vasa decided to move his court there from Krakow. The castle that presided over the old town became the Royal Castle, and Warsaw became Poland's capital city. Within the walls, the old town began to acquire its definitive form, assisted by a fire that destroyed a large part of the quarter in 1607. Burned-out Gothic tenement houses were rebuilt in late Renaissance and early Baroque styles. The neighbourhood became a showcase for mercantile prosperity. Its heyday lasted into the 18th century, but its prestige diminished as the nobility moved out to the suburbs where there was room for them to build palaces. Meanwhile, the Polish-Lithuanian Republic grew increasingly weak and vulnerable to its neighbours, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, which divided it up in a series of partitions. By the end of the century, they had removed it from the map altogether, and Warsaw was no longer the capital of a sovereign nation. The old town lost its role as an annex to the centre of political power and went into decline. As the wealthy bourgeoisie moved out, the market square filled up with humble traders. The neighbourhood that had boasted Warsaw's wealthiest residents became home to many of the city's poorest inhabitants. At the beginning of the 20th century, a plan to put a market hall on the square was met with dismay in Warsaw's cultural circles. The old town was following a storyline similar to those that unfolded in historic quarters across Middle Europe, of deterioration in the 19th century and adoption by heritage protectors in the 20th. Its principal advocate was a national organisation rather than a group of local enthusiasts. In 1911, the Society for the Care of Monuments of the Past established its headquarters on the market square, taking over a tenement house named after the building's 17th-century merchant owners, the Borichka family. The move reasserted the central place of the old town in Poland's symbolic landscape. It was followed in short order by the clearance of the market from the market square, which received a makeover that the heritage activists considered more appropriate to its status, giving it a more monumental character. The statue that served as its centrepiece and represented Warsaw's heraldic emblem, a mermaid brandishing a sword, was raised up and placed on a pedestal. By turning the Borichka house into a hub for gatherings and exhibitions, the Society furthered its aim of strengthening the cultural communities that were striving to protect the nation's heritage under foreign rule. Members of the Society supported the project with ventures into gentrification, buying old town tenement houses and doing them up. The new owners included several architects, a painter, and a poet, known by the nom de plume fraught, who wrote lyrical verse devoted to the old town. Visits to the Borichka house and the surrounding quarter were not only fashionable, but also, according to the Society's president, acts of opposition to the city's Russian overlords. In 1916, the 4 rows of tenement houses framing the market square were named after eminent civic Warsavians who had been active in the years before Poland's independence was extinguished. It was a notable early step in the process of converting the old town into an exhibition space for the teaching of history and the promotion of national consciousness. At the end of the First World War, Poland returned to the map as an independent state, following the collapse of 3 empires that had partitioned the Polish-Lithuanian Republic between them. The Second Republic resembled its predecessor in that it stretched a long way to the east and contained a variety of ethnic groups. Nearly 4 million Ukrainians found themselves within the borders of the new state, as did 2 million Jews, the second largest minority. In all, the minorities added up to more than 30% of the population. Warsaw was thus the capital of a nation whose form was consistent with the vision of its dominant political figure, Józef Piłsudski, who became the head of the restored Poland. Piłsudski believed that the new republic needed territories beyond its heartland, so that it would be big enough to hold its own as a regional power, and he was confident that it could incorporate ethnic minorities as citizens. He hankered after an even closer resemblance to the old Republic of both nations, but his proposals for a federation with Lithuania fell on stony ground. Instead, he had to satisfy himself with holding Vilnius, thereby creating a sacred cause for Lithuanian nationalists and setting the 2 countries at odds for the remainder of their spell of independence between the 2 wars. The dream of creating a new Polish-Lithuanian Republic was not shared by Piłsudski's great rival, Roman Dmowski, the great theorist of Polish ethnic nationalism and the leader of the national democracy movement. Dmowski understood the nation as a single living organism, with a unique spirit formed from culture, history, language, tradition, and race. He maintained that minorities posed threats to the Polish nation simply by their presence, undermining Polish culture by exposing it to contact with their own. While he considered that Slavic minorities could be neutralized by assimilating them into the Polish majority, he denied that Jews could ever be Poles. In his view, Jewish culture...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?